logistics.
All right.
And there it is. It's going up, so you better be prepared. And I'm talking to you, everybody out there just tuning into Sustainiacs. Thanks for downloading and thanks for being here. Welcome everybody back. I am the Sustainiac every time I come on here. My guest this time is Michael. You know what, Michael? I've never even asked you how to pronounce your last name, so I'm just going to Hoppenjans.
Hoppenjans is perfect. It's Mark Hoppenjans.
It is. Oh, why did I say Michael? Oh, because on the recording there it shows. Oh, well, Michael Vincent. That's me. You're Mark. I'm confused. It's Friday. Give me a break, folks. We're
Your mind's still in the middle of that solo. I can sense it.
It is. And you forgive us, people, but we've been talking about music for 20 minutes before we started doing this, so we may get off track every once in a while. I'd rather just talk about music, Mark, but let's talk about you and what the heck you're doing. You're VP of Sales and Sustainability or Sustainable Business at Sev-Rend. So tell us, who are you, man? How'd you get involved in that, and what does Sev-Rend do?
Sev-Rend's a packaging company, and 100% of my background, Michael's in packaging. You know that I started in corrugated and folding cartons, so I came out of the paper side. And with Sev-Rend in the early 2020s, I transitioned over into flexible. And we are a company out of Southern Illinois that ships throughout North America and a little bit into South America. 92% of our business is fresh produce. So if you think avocados and onions and citrus and apples and sweet potatoes, you're probably taking home something in our product.
If I look on those products, will I see Sev-Rend anywhere, or do I just need to know that it's you guys?
You need to know that it's us, but there's so few people, especially on the netting, the avocado netting and citrus netting, and the onion netting. There's so few companies that do it. There's 2 in Spain and 1 in Southern Illinois. So that's really what we capture. But when you look at sustainability and sustainable business, which for me really started in 2018, coming out of the paper side and now getting into flexibles with plastics and transitions, that's what we're really going to talk about mostly today. And the business case for sustainability, the cost to adopt, and I think you and I very much share looking at it in real terms, rather than just ideas and concepts, because that's what the business case is about.
Yeah, and you the thing is, this is in my mind, and why I gravitate towards talking about it in reality, in real terms, and not just concepts, et cetera, is that I think there's a lot of misconception around a lot of things that you have to deal with and probably have dealt with for a number of years. A lot of people are just hearing about it or just paying attention to it and don't understand that the issues with packaging and sustainability and all have been around for years and years and years and years. It's not a brand new phenomenon. It might be exploding in the minds of people and actually starting to hit some mandates or legislation in the form of EPR that people are starting to pay attention to. But the issues have been there. I mean, you've been dealing with stuff all the time. Packaging, did you just wake up and say packaging? And take us through your progression into packaging. You got into paper or corrugated and paper, et cetera. And I know some people that are in there. And then you went to flexibles, and now you're, VP of sustainability and sales. How did all that happen? Take us through that progression.
So the thing that we talk about in packaging when we recruit is when things are good, packaging's good, right? And when things are bad, packaging's still pretty good.
Well, if you're not moving stuff, okay.
So gotcha. It's like we're in the food business primarily, right?
Yeah.
So most of the things that we package have a very, very steady flow. We're never going to have the returns that Tesla has or anything like that. But our bandwidth is pretty tight. Our customer base is very consistent. But I was a history major in college, and I used to be very involved with ink and paper, and I would do images of like the Beatles and things in black and white with small pieces of ink and dots, right?
Oh, wow.
So the first time I saw ink being transferred to paper and different substrates in a high-speed environment, I was like, this is perfect. I don't.
Wait. Were you doing pointillism art, like with
exactly?
Quill?
I mean, I can pull up George Harrison's mustache from the late '60s and show you how much detail was in those kind of pictures. So
wow.
The first time I got into printed packaging, it was just perfect for me. It's the right business. So
and then so when you moved from corrugated to plastics or flexibles, I guess.
So I was in corrugated for 15 years, kind of on balance between the brown box and the value add, the nicer printed stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
then certainly now with Sev-Rend, we are just very very focused on what retailers are looking for. Something that most people don't know is that within the produce environment, retailers really drive everything. They drive the content, they drive the makeup of the material, they drive the data and the reporting. And something that you and I, Michael, talk about frequently is that when it comes to sustainable business, you have to have the data and the narrative right. And I think one of the things that you lead down often is that the narrative kind of gets wonky at times or confusing.
Yes.
And with sustainable business, we want the business case to be clear on cost, and we don't want it to be confusing because it doesn't need to be. You just got to put in the work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're 100% right. And digging through the issues that are there, it's my understanding that when you read at least when you read through the data, you dig behind the headlines, et cetera, et cetera. Corrugated and paper recycling is in sustainability is pretty good. We're pretty good at that, right?
No doubt.
And
There's a demand for it. There's a market for it. So the little squiggly, the inside of corrugated, the fluting
yeah,
part of it, that's
yes.
100% recycled material.
Yeah,
Okay,
but it's interesting
so
to me that why, in your estimation, or do you know the answer? I don't know. I'm not the expert. I'll lean on you a bit on this. Is why is that packaging so much further ahead than plastics packaging in our ability to capture and recycle it?
because you have an active customer in recycled mills that need that product back. So the infrastructure's been built. If you walk into the back of any retailer, Michael, you'll see the bins
Yeah.
and you'll see the balers and everything. And all the companies that are recycling that corrugated, they install those balers in the back of high use facilities. So the
Okay.
infrastructure that we talk about is, the pull is there, and you have an active market buying it. If I get recycled corrugated in those bales, I've got customers I can sell it to within a 10-mile radius right now, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to go back. So you've got an appetite for it to be pulled back in.
But that wasn't developed immediately, right? It took years and years for that to happen, right?
I mean, you're going to have to comment on this too. It seems like around 2005, those chasing arrows started to show up everywhere, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then about 2015 to 2020, people started to say, well, is that really getting recycled? Like, I mean, I
Yeah.
know the arrows are on
Exactly.
there, but I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
once it leaves my curb, is it really getting recycled? So, and that's a super interesting comparison because if you think about during COVID, you had all this product going to households and doors instead of coming out of the retailers where those balers were, right?
Well, we and the data shows a dip in recycling during those years
No
too.
doubt, because you didn't have the infrastructure to get it off the curb to get it back like you did with the
No, yeah,
bales. So,
PCR
yeah,
is much harder than PIR, or post
no doubt.
consumer is much harder than post industrial. Right? Yeah, that's what
Yeah,
you're alluding. Yeah,
yeah, no doubt. So,
that's crazy. So was it that the paper guys, the corrugated guys and gals, jumped on it first and went for it, or because in my mind it seems to me that what the business you're in now and the sustainability of it is more difficult because of the materials different. And like you were talking before, the netting and the films and so on and so forth. If it's red film or red netting, you
or
can't
laminated. Yeah.
necessarily you can't necessarily recycle it and use it for yellow ones. I mean, my
Yeah.
Vidalia onions aren't yellow, but my red, my red small
Potatoes.
petite potatoes are in red netting,
Sure.
and
Sure.
never shall the two meet. Right?
So I'll answer your first question. When you said did the corrugated guys just jump on it? They had a mill network already because of the medium, that fluted material that needed the recycled content.
Oh,
Okay.
so you're telling me that had to be recycled
That
content from the
medium is
very beginning.
100% recycled content in all corrugated globally.
Was it that way from the beginning? And that's
Since my career, it's been that way.
okay. So that
Yeah.
makes sense. All right.
So,
So there was
so
already set up and ready for action, ready for prime time.
right, and understanding that 82% of the raw materials, the mill network, is owned by 5 companies that also own box plants. If you think of Westrock and International Paper and Georgia
Oh
Pacific
yeah,
and
no, I'm
Pratt and
very
PCA,
familiar.
so they have an active customer network that pulls it through. And corrugated
Well,
is a rigid material. So when it comes to sorting, even if it's single stream and it's not coming out of those balers, you don't have to worry about it blowing around or whatever. It's got girth, just like a can or just like a bottle, right? But when
Yes.
you switch to the flexibles that are so light, that's where that single stream becomes really, really, really difficult, right?
Yeah, and that's where people need to understand a flexible isn't that flimsy ass smart water bottle that explodes water everywhere in the plane as soon as you take the top off, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Don't grip it too tight when you're taking off that top because you will squirt water right into the air. That's not flexible. That's a PET. Flexible is a film. It's an actual. It's the shrink wrap. Think of the
It's a
Glad
pouch.
wrap
It's
type of
what
stuff.
wraps around Oreos. It's a Doritos
Yes,
bag, right?
yeah, it's the
That's
foils.
flexible
Well,
packaging.
now you're getting into multi-level film, or multi films and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Multi-layered films, etc. And the foils and all that other kind of stuff, which are very light. And part of it also is that when you're going through a single stream, paper is paper is paper is paper, except for the printing.
Hmm.
Plastics and films are not. It could be LD, it could be LLD, it could be HD, it could be a PP, it could be a
Hmm.
PET, could be a PETG.
Could be a
Right?
multi-layer of two of those components, which adds a whole nother degree of separation, right?
100%. So the identification of it is one thing, which is really hard,
Yep.
but then the separation of them becomes even harder.
No doubt.
I mean, the cost factor is there, right? I mean, when you're doing corrugated cardboard, it all goes to one place.
And there's not different coatings and different. I mean, you have different grades and mediums and things like that.
Sure,
But once the
sure.
fibers get broken apart, none of that matters,
Yeah, I guess
right?
the level of entropy there isn't as bad as with the polymers, right? I mean,
No
that's
doubt. Great way to say it.
yeah.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
well, I like to flex my brain every once in a great while, and if I learn a cool word, I say it over and over. It makes me sound more
So with corrugated, you hear anywhere from 68 to 90% as far as recycling, right? But again,
right. Which
just
holy
this
cow!
active appetite for corrugated at all. You have dedicated recycled content mills, okay, that are
Yes,
zero virgin material. So all of those mills across North America, they need product, and they need it bad all the time, okay? So
yes,
the OCC price, old corrugated containers, is always pretty steady because of the demand, right? And the stream.
yes,
So as we switch over to recycles, comparing those percentages, 9% globally for plastics. That's rigid and flexible.
yeah.
Okay.
Globally, and it'd be better. It might be a little bit better, but the U.S. went from 9 to like 6.
Well, so 3% for flexibles globally. We recognize, Michael, that we've got customers that are very active with sustainable packaging at a 3% premium with a good QR code where the data and narrative are both there. We get
Yeah.
repeat orders. The consumers will look at that, they see 3%, and they're fine with it. But you go too much farther than 3%, and you lose that repeatability. So the challenge is within produce, packaging is almost always 10% of the wholesale price to the retailer.
Oh
So
wow, I didn't know
any
that.
yeah any solution that I come up with, I've got to make sure that it's not affecting anything more than 30%.
So is
So
that your job to find those solutions for that sustainable packaging? Is that what you're doing there? That's your responsibility.
what we're testing on scale, to scale right now, is we know that we've got to get it under 30%. So
Right.
some of the challenges with the cellulose and some of the plant-based, and we do offer some plant-based plastics, is that it's typically 3, 4, 5 times the cost. So if it's a one-time order for organic carrots that are seasonal, that's fine, but it's just not a very repeatable volume-based thing, right?
Yeah.
It can
And
be, and
and
it will be, but that's where that cost to adoption has to get driven down by scale.
is it totally a scale thing, or is it the lack of infrastructure that's in it that makes it so much more expensive than straight up virgin plastics? And how much is the price of? Let's just start there because there's a million different questions to go there, right?
Well, plastics is a petroleum product, and as far as the
Yeah,
commodity and moving raw materials and picking up inventories, there's a there's a lot of control over cost in a virgin plastic piece, right?
Right.
So you have two challenges. The most of the companies that are developing newer materials are small to medium companies, more entrepreneurial, venture capital coming up with this, and then you do have bigger companies that control those inventories. So one of the challenges that we're having for 2024 right now is that January, the PCR initiatives, post-consumer recycled, are going in at a lot of the retailers. So we've driven that cost down under the 3% to where it's only 1 or 2, which is
Oh,
great.
okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you also have the suppliers of that virgin plastic materials that are going to pull more inventory, export inventory back into North America. So what we're anticipating is the cost of a current plastic solution that's not sustainable, just conventional, is
Mm,
going to be reduced. So now that distance between a sustainable option is going to grow again for the consumer, right?
right.
So it's going to be like a
Right.
secondary challenge to the consumer that, okay, we're still doing the sustainable option, but now they're going to have a different comparison. So that's part of the competitive challenge that you and I had talked about, where it's going to be a gradual but a jagged line towards sustainable options.
It is. It's gonna sputter and start and sputter and stop and go forward. But how does it ever get there? If that is the case, I mean, what are the techniques that you can use or that you do use to try and promote that forward? Is there active? Do you have to have activity that really points towards, for instance, like you said, once you get over that 3%, you lose the consumer,
Hmm.
right? You've
For
lost the
repeats.
consumer. Yeah, for repeats, you've lost them. But there's also studies out there by fairly well-known schools like MIT and
Heard
Harvard
of it?
that right that say, yeah, you heard of them, that say 64% of even my I don't know how old you are, but I'm a Gen Xer, right? I'm almost a baby boomer. But even my generation, 64% will say, "Hey, we'll buy sustainable packaging over non-sustainable packaging, and we'll pay up to 10% more." But then when they actually go in to do it, they don't.
Right.
They don't do it. They say they will, but they won't. Is that because they don't know it is? Because I tell you what, I've got to go to the store because I like to grill and do that kind of stuff
Hmm.
during the weekend. And when I go, I don't look to see if the packaging is sustainable or not. What I do is I buy individual onions instead of ones that are that are in the bags,
Bulk
and
is okay. It's got its place.
it's got its place. Now the clerks look at me funny when I just start dumping zucchinis and onions on the
Yeah.
conveyor belt. They're like, "What are you nuts?" And I'm like, "I got to wash them anyways." And that,
So one thing very much keeps me honest in that there are more, or I should say, it it keeps me very, very positive on the subject of sustainability, and that is we've hired a lot since 2018, like I talked about, in their 20s.
okay,
And there are more and more people coming into the workforce who will be alive in 2050 and 2060, to your point, and they have genuine thoughts and concerns about what things are going to look like. So those were the folks that were initially asking me, but how much actually gets recycled, right?
yeah,
So I think the means to communicate and the means to retain them as customers,
yeah,
and get that loyalty, I think that communication base is in place now,
yeah.
and that's part of the positive indicator,
I
right?
got you. And that makes a
Um,
lot of sense. And let's be fair. When we talk about recycling rates, the rate of plastics and other materials that are recycled once they're put into the recycling stream in the correct way is very, very high. It's I think there's like loss of like 3% of volume or something was one of the
mhm.
last things that I read across the board. It's the fact that they don't get in there in the first place.
Yeah, I
Right?
agree. And I know you're familiar with Republic, and we are also, they're a good partner
Yeah.
for us, and they keep us
Yeah.
educated out of their Champs facility in the St. Louis area, and um, the MRFs are really, really good at it. The technology is really good. It's,
Yeah,
most of it's,
once it gets in there,
yeah,
right? Once it's in there in a
no
proper
doubt.
manner, they're good.
And
Yeah.
the teams at Republic are very good at finding customers for it. It's not like they want
Hmm.
to sell you, you know, cubic feet going into a landfill. They would prefer to resell and have a product to resell. They're a profit business too.
Yeah.
It's just the collecting and separating and getting it and making it circular. That's clunky right now. Getting it from the curb, all the way back into where it's in an extruder and being put back into a product.
Well, even from the kitchen to the curb is difficult. There's, if you look at like the recycling partnership or
Hmm.
Stina Corporation, et cetera, that do all these data studies for government and for themselves. The
Hmm.
recycling partnership is supported by a lot of companies, a lot of CPG companies, as a
Hmm.
matter of fact, in their efforts. But they study all these things, and one of their goals is post consumer. I mean, they don't even deal with post industrial. I don't think
Hmm.
it's completely just post consumer. And there's you know better than 30% or I think it's better than 50% of the
Hmm.
shrinkage happens at the house before it even gets to the curb, where
Hmm.
it doesn't even make it there. The consumer just it goes into the regular garbage bin just because it's just one piece of plastic,
Hmm.
or I just don't feel like taking the label off, or
And
you know
it's interesting because we talked about the Chasing Arrows logo, and it's like, at what point do you kick the can farther down, right?
yeah,
Because if I'm the producer and I print the arrows on there, it's like, okay, I gave you a recyclable thing. It's up to you to recycle it, right?
yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the infrastructure's there or the MRF's there to where it's going, that it can actually be recycled. And then to your point, it doesn't mean that they're actually going to recycle it, even if
No,
it
it
is,
doesn't.
right?
Mm-mm. No,
So you're trying
doesn't
to align
guarantee
a lot of
anything.
things.
Yeah, it doesn't get guarantee anything. In fact, wasn't you deal in California quite a bit. I mean, if you're in produce, you deal with California.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you probably don't have a lot of produce.
There's a few
But
avocados and a little citrus out here, yeah.
there's a little bit being produced in California. But did they not just have some legislation or mandates on there around the CPG stamping recyclable on plastics that
Hmm.
aren't recyclable? And I should have used my quotation marks because I made fun of them for that, because that's baloney, which is a kind word for saying BS, because it's all recyclable. They
Hmm.
just don't recycle it yet, right? But I mean, there's that issue, right? It's all recyclable. It's just the infrastructure's not there to do it in
Yeah, and,
most cases.
and I think the model that Canada is using, has found its way into the U.S. too. As you look at Maine and you look at Oregon and now California, you mentioned Minnesota just passed legislation, and what EPR means, extended producer responsibility, is
Right
is
on.
just that. It's that the person who packs the packaging, or in my case, the packaging manufacturer, or to some extent even the consumer, is going to start having a hand in making sure that this is circular and taking responsibility for end of life, right? So
Right.
what Canada's done is you make a prepayment now. So
Right.
if I have an onion packer in Ontario, they'll pay $18,000 and change to their MRF for that quarter based on the plastic that's been brought into inventory that's going to be shipped that quarter. Okay?
But does, no,
And so
okay.
that's what extended producer responsibility means, because they're helping the MRF build the infrastructure for that 2035 guideline.
Who's auditing that? Who's auditing where that money's going?
Oh, I mean, it's audited internally by the government. Yeah,
Okay.
they have auditors too, and of course,
Yeah,
the MRFs, they want that to be audited because
of course.
that's revenue for them. So, relatively new. I believe they're about a year and a half into it, but I think you're going to see more and more of that model. I also
Yeah.
think you're going to see companies like Sev-Rend get touched on with that model, where the plastic that we're shipping out, some of what we ship will, a percentage will have to be paid to MRFs in the regions that we
Yeah,
supply.
because you broke those down, and that's a good point. You're producing the packaging that people are going to use. The EPR extends to them, both of you. So is that double dipped on? I mean, are you going to have to pay, and then the people who use your packaging to package their goods pay as well? Which I'm not saying is wrong. I'm just saying, is that how it works?
So as it works right now, if you look at Oregon and Maine, the company that packs the material and ships it out their door, they're the responsible party.
Okay, so you're
Okay.
kind of their scope two EPR.
I anticipate. I anticipate that the way that EPR works and the desire to build the infrastructure, I anticipate packaging producers, and there has been some language in the California legislation that packaging producers will also have to participate in that. Okay.
So I'm not
I
familiar with all those languages, and you probably are. Go ahead, finish your thought. I'm sorry, I had a. Go ahead.
well, I also think that you're going to see by the end of this decade that when a consumer walks out of Vons or Trader Joe's or Kroger or anywhere else, you'll see $7.68 based on the packaging that they walked out with. That there will
Oh
be,
yeah, kind of like a fuel surcharge,
yep,
and
or if you had a case of Coke and it's 10, it's 10 cents a bottle. I mean,
yeah.
it's yeah.
I saw a fuel surcharge on my bill at a restaurant once. I was like,
Did you
what?
really? What state?
Like, what are you kidding me? Is it
Yeah.
Tennessee? I'm like, what?
But I do think you'll see those three parties have sort of an extended producer responsibility charge that's going to help to build the infrastructure. Now, I'm not advocating it. I'm just telling you the reality. And
Yeah, no.
I do think the retailers will get to avoid it because it's a pass through.
Well, if it's a pass through, that's not too bad. Well, yeah, you're right. By nobody's fault. It's just the way it's set up and the way we are is the really like the grocery, the end of the
Hmm.
line, sale, the retailer, their margins suck, don't they?
I think it depends on the product. I mean,
Yeah, but
I
when you're talking about produce, it's really not that good of a margin, is it? In those, there's not a
yeah,
lot of room.
I think the balance on produce margins is pretty good.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
didn't. I
there's
thought it was.
more and more demand, especially coming out of COVID. You've got a lot of people that are cooking at home and trying new dishes and using more vegetables.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
you also have more folks eating healthier. So
Yeah.
yeah, margins have been pretty good on produce. So
That's cool. So in this EPR language, do you see it possibly maturing as it goes? Because I would imagine that if it's there, you're using plastic, but if you can prove or show that
hmm
it's got X amount of content that is PCR or PIR,
hmm
what have you, that you would have scales of those prepayments that you would make, or does that just not matter because you're trying to get it
well,
back into the MRF anyways, right?
it's a great observation because the easiest and cheapest way to just meet guidelines right out of the gate, which is 20% post-consumer recycled, 15% reduction in virgin plastic, is to have more recycled content in the packaging, right?
Sure.
And so if you can build that circle to where you're scaling and getting more volume of recycled materials, that'll continue to drive the cost down.
Well, that's where the
So,
auditing of the payments, et cetera, and where they're going and what they're paid for
mhm,
starts to become very, very important, right? Because you want to, I see two different things, right? You want to get the playing field for the recycled content packaging and the virgin packaging or
mhm,
virgin polymers in there to be as level as possible. And you want to encourage the recycling and the infrastructure development at the same time. So there's a lot of things that need to come out of that prepayment, if you
mhm.
will, the EPR prepayment, right? And that's where the data and the auditing becomes incredibly important if it's going to be as effective as we want it to be, right?
Yeah, but that can be done,
Yeah,
right? I mean, the flow of virgin raw materials in and virgin petroleum product that are, on the natural conventional plastics, and you should be able to see the industries making those adjustments. And I think you will. I just think it'll be gradually before it's suddenly.
yeah. So, do you deal on the procurement of the packaging of the materials that come in to produce this
You mean
packaging?
the resins and the pellets?
Yeah,
I do not.
you
So
don't.
we have
Okay.
other we have a group at Sev-Rend that handles that out of Collinsville.
I got you. I was just wondering if you're seeing more and more offerings from those people like Dow. Dow makes a ton of that type of stuff, right? The
Hmm.
resins for that type of thing, especially in the flex. Well, maybe we're talking about flexibles, but they're huge in the flexibles. And I know that they've got a lot of because I've interviewed them and talked to a number of people there. They've got big initiatives to try and figure out how to reclaim that PCR flexible. Right? They're driving for it. And I was just wondering if because they're going to be on the hook too. It's
Hmm.
it's 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 not like you've got you're going to have this wild west of, well, recycled's at this. Well, we're going to drop the virgin to that. That's death to the whole system, right? If they do
Yeah.
that, I was just wondering if you're seeing that collaboration from the suppliers and the packaging that you're getting in.
As far as trying to build the infrastructure, I
Yeah,
think
or those incentives to use more of their recycled product, right? Because it's got to extend that far eventually, does it not? In order to make this,
we're not
really
seeing.
impact.
Yeah, I mean, it's again a great observation. We're not seeing it yet.
Gotcha.
The big producers of virgin plastic, they are exploring other options and making sure that
Yes,
they've got their finger on top of it.
absolutely.
There are alternatives out there. Interesting that you talk about the plant-based and different pieces because it also has to be food safe.
Right.
So, for example, right now, the plant-based options that are coming in, um, you do have a lot where you have to make sure that it's laminated and not contacting direct, right?
Yeah.
You're using for structural purposes, you're using a post-consumer recycled or a plant-based product and avoiding the food contact.
Mm.
And that's where, cost to adopt an infrastructure, just getting those details worked out. And
Yeah.
I think the piece of this that you and I haven't really brought into it is that within all of our growers and packers, you have automation all throughout North America and all in South America. You have similar machines and similar tensions and similar heat points. So as these innovations get developed, the speed has to be maintained on those machines as well. So that's part of the infrastructure and cost to adopt too. You can't just come up with a product that the price point makes sense, and maybe it is the recycled, and now you've got a whole network all over the country of produce packers that are going to have to make changes to their equipment that are going to be out of pocket costs,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah. It's got to be
Uh,
like a drop in fuel, right? Like a
yeah, so
biodiesel is
you have
drop
to
in
kind
fuel.
of like you have to balance out that transition, and that's
Right.
why you and I talk about gradually then suddenly, or that jagged slow upward line, because a lot of things got to catch up to a line, even when something works and the material cost is there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just reading about shellfish exoskeletons being used to make polystyrene, expanded
Sure.
polystyrene, which was amazing. And one of the best things about it is that it's actually a lower cost. It does not degrade the structural composition, or I mean the performance
Hmm.
of the materials, and it's a drop in resin. It doesn't require any changes, and
Hmm.
those are the ultimate things that you want to see in those alternative type of polymers, I guess, or sources for those polymers, right?
Yeah, the research PhDs, and we're working with two different universities right now, partnering on ideas and testing extrusion for what you're talking
Yeah,
about. And it's the same, the inspiration and the ingenuity of the engineering teams and are just amazing.
yeah,
What they can come up, what they can test quickly, and then working it over to us on how to scale it. The inspiration is there. It's just the speed and time, right? That's
yeah.
what I talk about gradually and suddenly. It's got to work on my equipment. It's got to work on the whole Citrus Network's equipment, and the price has to be right.
Gotcha.
So that's really the
Yeah.
stages that we're going through right now when it comes to product development.
So I want to touch on collaboration between, but I also want to talk about EPR just because when I've had other people on about EPR and about other things too, like tax credits, et cetera, and where the EU is and Asia
Hmm.
is and South America and Canada, for that matter, as opposed to the United States, and how they're different political structures make it easier for them to have this mass mandate, and we have this patchwork of state mandates, and then
Hmm.
the FDA, et cetera. How difficult is it dealing with that right now? And do you see that getting more difficult? Like in logistics, it gets very difficult because of the different, you got CARB out in California,
Hmm.
where you're at, that's got their own, and they're very progressive on on their mandates, et cetera. They're always ahead. I mean, the joke is Europe, California, East Coast, and the rest of the United States, right?
Europe,
And
California, Canada, East Coast, and the rest of the United
yeah,
States.
okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I forgot Canada. That's probably true. That's right. I forgot part of that equation. Um, You see the same thing in EPR legislation and in yours, and how difficult is it to navigate that? What do you have to watch for?
Well, I think we have 4 states with EPR legislation that
Yeah,
is actually getting momentum, right? I mean,
right.
it's in practice, what they're putting forward. I think EPR, consistent EPR legislation across the country or even federal level, I think is going to be extremely difficult in the current environment. Now,
Yeah,
again, I'm 92% produce,
yeah.
and the agricultural and packing community has a pretty strong reputation with with their habits and with their practices. So when
Hmm.
it comes to the carbon variable that you talked about, they don't really get dinged too hard on it.
Yeah,
Scope one
yeah,
and scope two emissions are pretty easily tracked.
yeah.
I think if the produce community, suddenly, especially when you get into imports and exports, had to start getting into scope threes, I think that would be a massive challenge. But up until now, um, there's legislation here and there that can be frustrating, especially regarding bulk or things of that nature. Because if you go purely to bulk, you're going to have a very high level of shrink, and food safety is going to be an issue. You you
Mm,
know
hmm.
um,
Hmm.
there was some legislation not far back that said by 26 it's got to be 75% bulk, and then by 28 it's got to be 90% bulk, and it fell. And you've seen that happen in France too, where they had elimination of single-use plastics, and then they had to back it up a little bit. So I think my industry specifically, we're kind of riding the good wave of goodwill
Yeah.
with practices and being so important. So I think we'll be on the third or fourth tier when it comes to the carbon part.
I got you. I mean, and to that point, riding the wave of goodwill, is it not we're living in right now in an industrial chance to do the right thing and avoid some mandates that might come out that might not be as efficient or have the intended consequences we would like, and avoid some ignorance in those mandates by doing the right thing now and moving forward voluntarily, type of thing.
I think you're very wise to play. We were
Yeah.
forced to play in 2016. One of our
Yeah.
larger customers is based in France,
Uh
so
huh.
we had to start reporting with EcoVadis in 2016, and we continue to do so.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Gotcha.
that's a supply chain responsibility platform where you get audited on 308 things, and
Right.
every year your score gets updated in reference to the previous year. So
Yeah, I'm
um,
familiar. There's a lot of bids in different industries where you've got to provide those scores from EcoVadis
yes,
in order to even play, right?
yeah, and so I still think I think it's good to be willing. I think it's good to stay, as you said, 3 years ahead of what you think the market and industry are doing.
Yeah,
The really difficult thing is kind of balancing the inspiration and excitement versus practice, right? Because
yeah,
you do have a lot of companies coming out with, oh, this would be great. It's fully compostable, or you can throw it out in your yard, and there's zero microplastics, and it's not going to affect
yeah,
anything. But when it's 4 to 6 times the cost, you kind of look foolish on the back end, or you've wasted resources because it can't be put into practice, right?
yeah,
So I think myself and Severin, Michael, we try to balance that where we want to be aware of all the opportunities and all the raw materials we can be running through our extruders. But we can't just be purely evangelists. We also have to make sure we have the business case because we're a supplier to perishable products and they need to be absolutely sure that they're working on the machines. So I think we're balancing that out with the excitement and the reality of the practice.
yeah. No, that makes. I mean, you've got a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders and stakeholders,
Hmm.
employees, et cetera, and your customers in order to make it sound business practice when you're starting to go or going towards more sustainable packaging. It makes 100% sense. In terms of collaboration, right?
Hmm.
You've obviously heard of Pure Cycle, and Procter and Gamble is a big backer of Pure Cycle, et cetera. Do you see? I mean, that's a huge indicator that the industry is starting to take some control of their own resourcing and not relying on those MRFs, et cetera, and dumping the money in ahead of EPR, et
Hmm.
cetera, to try and secure their own, I guess, internal, raw material source, right? Do you see that as a trend across the board, or is that, and regardless, are they, can you, is the collaboration there, or is it become a war of sustainability between between different providers, et cetera?
I think the example with Procter and Gamble and the examples HEB is another one that has a very active recycling component. Out of
Yeah,
Texas, where most retailers who were taking back plastics and taking back recycles, they were not able to sustain the program. And
right,
your Pure Cycle example is another one. There's been 8 or 10 that they got out of the gate, but they really didn't sustain themselves, right?
right.
But I believe that the CPG companies, such as Procter and Gamble that you mentioned, ultimately they'll look at sustainability and sustainable packaging as a customer loyalty program. They'll be
Yeah,
tracking, it'll be gamified, and you'll see it to where yes, I want to go to Sprouts, and not only do I want to go to Sprouts, but I want to have a positive score on this. I think that the marketing and data that they can command, they'll look at their packaging, not just their
yeah.
products, as customer loyalty, and I think you'll see a lot of success in that, and that'll potentially be a bigger foundation later in this decade than anything else.
Wow. Okay, that's very very interesting. It seems to me that you need that volume across all boards to make everything sustainable, and by capturing your own or
Mhm.
internal, that's what can kill it, right? That's what can kill it. You've got to let everybody play, don't you? I mean, a rising tide, lifts all boats, type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly do want all boats to rise, and I would say, my compliments to the produce industry. I think that while it's competitive in a lot of areas, I think best practices are shared quickly, and that includes packaging. But you have to look at things in 1 to 3% improvements, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Hmm.
if you look at 2050 and you look at the, science-based targets and net zero standards, we're supposed to be doing what we're doing, reducing waste and reducing greenhouse gases by 2050. There's not going to be
Yeah.
a 20% reduction in 1 year,
No.
so
Yeah.
you and I very much agree on a realistic view towards sustainability and sustainable packaging. Well, a realistic view means that if you produced 37,806 metric tons in 2023, you know, tying that to a dollar sales metric or a pound metric, you need to make sure that you're slowly producing less, right?
Yeah.
And a 1 or 2 or 3% improvement year over year is fine. But as long as we make this a massive picture and keep everybody confused, it's going to be difficult to hit those little improvements. So,
It is, and that confusion really leads people to a misconception of success and failure, right? I
and
mean,
frustration, right?
and
Like,
frustration.
what I'm doing doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and mistrust for
Right.
for that, right? I mean, like you were talking earlier, if you throw it in there, what is really getting recycled anyways? And that
Hmm.
that leads us to wish cycling, which has become a term,
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, I agree with you. We got to be realistic. I think stripping away the hype and getting the
Hmm.
information out there and evangelizing what people like Sev-Rend are doing,
Hmm.
and what those challenges are, and how people can look at those is really important. And I thank you for coming on and talking about those things, Mark. What do you want to leave the people with?
I think that what we just wrapped up with is really important.
Yeah.
We try very hard to walk the walk. We have a long way to go. We're trying to get to silver status for EcoVadis this year, which will put us in the top 15% globally, which would be great, especially for an American company.
Oh wow.
That would be, a good accomplishment, but there's a lot we want to do better. But, I am optimistic. I think as younger consumers are coming in, the awareness is much better. And I do think that it is a steady upward trend. But I do want to get everybody concentrated on the idea that you're making small improvements. You can take your coffee in a Yeti instead of a paper cup. Great. It really
Yeah.
is something that simple. Or if you can buy something that you regularly buy in a slightly more sustainable container, those small percentages and those small habits really, really make a difference. And I think from the All Boats Rise example, we do need to tell a very direct and tangible story on what gets recycled and what doesn't, and what the timeline is on end of life for different materials. So we're working at it.
Yeah. Yeah, we are. Absolutely. And I'd like to add that even though you're buying a Yeti, don't buy one for every season. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The whole Stanley Cup craze, which I'm not against them, just
Yeah,
against the
yeah,
fact
yeah,
that,
yeah,
there's a Christmas one, there's a spring one, there's a
yeah,
Valentine's
yeah.
one. So
They
that's a
kind
good
of
thing.
went full American Girl in their marketing, right? And now you
Yeah,
got,
it did.
yeah,
It
it's,
was like,
yeah,
nah, that's not the purpose of these things, people.
right. Well,
But
mine's got a bunch of healthy dents in it,
yeah,
and I've
I
got a
got
pretty
you.
good life, so that I think that, yeah, that's the idea. So
That is the idea.
we can all
It's
do a little bit
reusable.
better, right? A little bit better.
A little bit better, a little
Yeah.
bit better. That's fantastic stuff, Mark. Thank you so much for being on. Should people go, companies go somewhere to learn more about Sev-Rend and what you guys are doing, and how do people reach out?
Absolutely. Sev-Rend.com. It's sev-rend.com. We're a great company in Southern Illinois. We've been around for a while, carry no debt, and we've got a great team in place and more coming on board. So super excited about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hey, peace and love, everybody. We'll see you next time on the Sustainiacs.
Thank you, Michael.